In the heart of the Rockies, where the winters bite with relentless fury, one prospector discovered a simple yet revolutionary way to outsmart the howling winds. His ingenuity didn't come from tools or firepower, but from a humble wall built not just of logs, but of survival. When the whiteouts came, this wall kept him warm when all seemed lost. But what drove this man to innovate in the harshest of environments? Before we dive into this remarkable tale, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're fascinated by true stories of survival and frontier ingenuity, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an even greater secret of the wilderness. The wind tore through the barren expanse of the Rockies with an angry howl, whipping snow into blinding sheets. Miles from the nearest town, the wilderness was a harsh, unforgiving place. For the men who dared to brave these mountains, survival wasn't a matter of choice. It was a daily battle against nature itself. And for Thomas "Tom" McAllister, a lone prospector who had found his refuge in a cabin perched high in the foothills, it was a battle he hadn't been winning. In late November 1847, the weather turned violent. What had begun as a crisp winter morning swiftly escalated into a blizzard. Tom had seen it coming, but there was no escaping the cold once the storm hit. The wind howled through the pines, bending the trees and pushing snow so thick it seemed to swallow up the world. Inside his cabin, Tom tried to stoke the fire, his hands shaking from the biting chill in the air. Even with the hearth crackling, the cold never quite retreated. He wrapped his thick woolen coat tighter, but it didn't help much. The walls of his cabin, constructed in haste months earlier, weren't built to withstand the constant assault of mountain winds. Gaps between the logs allowed icy drafts to creep in, and despite the thick layer of snow outside, it felt as though the mountain itself was inside, biting at his bones. That night, as the wind began to scream louder, Tom sat in front of the fire, staring at the thick, swirling snow beyond his window. The thought crossed his mind, could he survive another winter like this? The old prospector was a man of few words and fewer friends, having chosen a solitary life in the wilderness for its simplicity. But tonight, simplicity felt like a death sentence. The freezing cold gnawed at his resolve. His thoughts turned to something he had often considered, the possibility of building a better shelter, one that could withstand even the most brutal storms. The wind rattled the shutters, and Tom knew he couldn't wait any longer. The mountain had given him the cold shoulder long enough. In the dead of night, by firelight and frost, he began to plan. There had to be a way to use the elements against themselves. He knew the terrain, the snow, the winds, and now he had to use that knowledge to his advantage. The storm raged. For days, a relentless beast that tested the limits of Tom's endurance. By the time the whiteout began to settle, he had already begun to experiment with an idea. The old prospector was no stranger to hard labor, but what he envisioned now wasn't just about logging or piling up stone. It was about rethinking how the wind could be beaten. For weeks, Tom worked through the frozen mornings and bitter afternoons, collecting materials from the surrounding area. He gathered large stones, logs, and thick timber, moving them with a steady, methodical precision. He would build a structure that would protect his cabin not just from the snow, but from the fierce winds that often brought the chill inside. The idea was simple. He would construct a wind-baffle wall, a barrier designed to disrupt the fury of the mountain winds before they could reach his cabin. Positioned in a strategic location near the cabin, it would act as a first line of defense, redirecting the wind and forcing it to flow around the cabin rather than straight at it. It was an idea inspired by the natural contours of the land, how the mountain ridges bent and twisted in a way that redirected the elements. Tom worked tirelessly with each stone, each log, and each twist of rope, shaping the wall into something that, at first glance, looked unremarkable. It was built with alternating layers of stone and timber, each layer designed to absorb and deflect the wind's energy. The wall was high enough to shield the cabin from the worst of the storm's direct force, but not so imposing that it would obstruct Tom's view of the surrounding wilderness. It took days to complete, the work grueling and backbreaking. His hands were raw from the ropes and the cold, and his breath came in clouds of steam that froze instantly in the air. But as the wind howled one more time, Tom stood back and surveyed his work, a feeling of quiet satisfaction stirring deep inside him. This wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a symbol of his defiance against the mountain's fury. That night, as the storm returned with all its fury, Tom sat inside his cabin, a new sense of hope rising in his chest. He could hear the wind roaring outside, but this time it was different. Instead of the usual shrill, biting howls that seemed to tear through the very walls of the cabin, the wind now passed over the wall and skittered harmlessly into the distance. It was as if the wind had been tamed, redirected by Tom's creation. And as the warmth of the fire slowly seeped into the room, Tom finally allowed himself to smile. He had not only survived the winter, he had taken control of it. The Wind-Baffle Wall would keep him warm, no matter how fierce the storm outside became. The days that followed the completion of Tom's Wind-Baffle Wall brought a rare calm. The storm that had whipped through the mountains had temporarily abated, leaving a thick, silent blanket of snow covering the ground. But even in the quiet, Tom knew better than to become complacent. The Rockies had a way of reminding you just how quickly peace could turn into chaos. It wasn't long before the weather turned again, this time with a ferocity that shook the very foundations of the earth. The first gusts of wind hit the cabin in the early morning, a sharp, biting cold that seemed to slice through the mountains. The weather forecasters in nearby towns may have predicted another gentle snowfall, but the wilderness had other plans. Within hours, the light snow turned into a full-blown blizzard. The howling wind, once mild, became a roar that filled the air with an unnatural intensity. Tom could hear the wind pushing against his cabin from outside. It was a familiar sound, one that had kept him up many a night, but this time was different. The howls of the wind were muffled, softened, redirected. Tom stood at the window, watching as the wind hit the wall he had built. He could see the gusts swirl around the stones and logs, bending like water around a rock. The wall held. For the first time he felt safe. The temperature plummeted rapidly, and the cold seeped into the air. But inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire clung to the walls, refusing to be pushed out by the fierce storm outside. Tom stepped away from the window and walked to the hearth, feeling the warmth beneath his boots. It was then that he realized the true brilliance of his wall. Not only did it keep the wind at bay, but it also shielded the cabin from the harshest effects of the snowstorm. He didn't need to stack extra wood or struggle with damp, cold air. His creation had worked. The storm raged for hours, but Tom sat in front of the fire, hands resting comfortably on his knees. As the wind whistled outside, he could hear only the crackling of the firewood and the soft murmur of the snow. It was a strange, almost surreal feeling to be so at ease in the face of nature's wrath. The storm outside was vicious, but inside his cabin, warmth and safety prevailed. He had done it. His Wind-Baffle Wall had passed its first test. The days following the storm were marked by a deep sense of relief, but Tom knew this was only the beginning. Word would inevitably spread. People out in the wilderness were always looking for new ways to survive, and a structure that could withstand such a brutal storm was bound to draw attention. Tom had built his wall for survival, not for fame. But he also knew he couldn't keep it to himself forever. The isolation that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a prison. It didn't take long for a pair of trappers to stumble upon Tom's cabin, lost in the whiteout of the following week. Their faces were haggard from exhaustion, their eyes wide with the uncertainty of how close they had come to the edge of danger. They had been wandering the wilderness, struggling to find shelter from the wind and snow, when they saw the outline of Tom's cabin looming in the distance. The smoke rising from the chimney was like a beacon in the storm. Tom greeted them at the door, his expression unreadable. He had never been one for much company, but necessity always had a way of pushing people together in the mountains. The trappers were more than grateful for the warmth and food that Tom offered them, and they took to the hearth eagerly. As they thawed out and drank the strong, bitter coffee Tom brewed, their conversation turned inevitably to the subject of the wall. "You've got something there," one of the trappers, a burly man with a rough beard, said as he eyed the stones and logs of the Wind-Baffle construction. "Never seen anything like it before. How'd you build that?" Tom's fingers twitched, and he set his mug down, turning toward the window where the storm still raged. He didn't want to speak of it, didn't want to open the door to outside curiosity, but the idea of his wall helping someone else, giving them a chance at survival, that made it seem different, necessary. He could feel the weight of his own creation, both the pride and the responsibility it carried. "I just did what needed to be done," he muttered, his voice soft but steady. "The wind here will kill you faster than the cold." The trappers exchanged glances, and it was clear that they were impressed more by Tom's ingenuity than by his words. Soon they were asking him how he built it, what materials he used, and if there was any chance he would share the design. Tom had always been one to keep his methods close to his chest, but the mountain men were a different breed. They knew the value of good construction and the necessity of sharing what worked. Tom nodded, reluctantly agreeing to show them his work, to teach them what he had learned. By evening, the trappers had taken their leave, but not before promising to spread word of the wall. As the storm began to die down, Tom stared at the fire burning in the hearth, feeling the warmth wash over him again. Word was spreading, just as he'd known it would. His creation was no longer just a solution for him. It was becoming a new tool for survival in the mountains. The winds would come again, and this time there would be more people ready to face them head-on. As winter dug in deeper across the mountains, the world around Tom McAllister began to shift. The storms came more frequently now, each one more vicious than the last, each one testing the limits of his Wind-Baffle Wall. But no matter how relentless the wind, his cabin remained an island of warmth and safety. His design, once a personal solution to an impossible problem, had become a lifeline for others braving the wilderness. It wasn't long before the first group of mountain men showed up, eager to learn his methods. One by one they arrived, trappers, hunters, and pioneers who had heard the whispers in the wilderness. They came seeking refuge from the cold and answers to the same question: how could they survive the biting winds of the Rockies? Tom had no desire for fame, but the growing number of visitors outside his cabin signaled that his creation was no longer just his own. At first, Tom met them with hesitation. He was used to solitude, to quiet days spent in the company of his thoughts and the mountains. But the practical side of him recognized that his Wind-Baffle Wall had the potential to save lives, and so, reluctantly, he began sharing his design. He taught them how to construct the baffle wall, showing them how to lay the stones and logs in precise layers, how to place the structure at the best angle against the wind, and how to integrate it with the surrounding terrain. The first few men to adopt his techniques were skeptical, but Tom's insistence on meticulous craftsmanship soon convinced them. They understood that the wall wasn't just a barrier. It was a calculated defense against nature's most unpredictable and deadly force. The men who learned from Tom weren't just looking for shelter. They were looking for survival, and his Wind-Baffle Wall offered more than that. It provided hope. With each new cabin constructed using his design, Tom saw more and more of the wilderness change. The small pockets of trappers, who once relied on hastily built cabins with little thought for protection, now stood behind walls that could withstand the harshest storms. There was a sense of unity, of shared survival, born out of the necessity of winter's relentless rage. And for the first time in years, Tom felt a sense of connection to the other men in the mountains, a bond forged through the shared goal of surviving together. But not everyone was as open to the idea. Some men, Those who had spent their whole lives in the wilderness scoffed at the idea of a wall. They preferred their solitary, rugged existence, their old ways of doing things. They believed that true survival was about grit and toughness, not about building a wall to shield oneself from nature. Tom's teachings were met with resistance in some quarters, but the evidence of the wall's success was hard to ignore. The once isolated world of the mountain men was evolving, slowly, into something more collective. The change was subtle at first, but it was there, a shift in the way men thought about survival. The wilderness no longer had to be faced alone. By the time the thaw came in early spring, Tom's creation had already become more than just a defensive structure. The Wind-Baffle Wall had turned into a symbol of strength, ingenuity, and resilience. It wasn't just a barrier against the wind anymore, it was a testament to human determination. Tom had never set out to be remembered. He was content to live out his days in the mountains, far from the bustling towns and noise of the world. But as the seasons passed, the growing number of men who had built cabins with his designs began to tell their stories. They spoke of Tom's quiet genius, of how a simple wall had kept them alive when the storms would have surely taken them. The wall wasn't just something to hide behind. It was a testament to the ways humans could adapt to the most hostile environments. One day, Tom awoke to find a small group of men standing outside his cabin. They had traveled from distant parts of the mountain range, and from the way they stood in the snow, it was clear they had come for something more than just a lesson. They had come for recognition. "Tom McAllister," one of the men called out, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Tom, bundled in his thick fur coat, stepped outside. The men looked at him with respect, eyes filled with a reverence that made him uneasy. He had never sought attention, never looked for thanks, but here they were, waiting for him to speak. "We've been using your wall for a year now," the man continued. "You saved us more than once. Our families are safe because of what you taught us." Tom nodded, his gruff features betraying little emotion. He wasn't sure how to respond. He didn't want to be celebrated. He only wanted to survive, and in helping others, perhaps that was enough. But the men weren't done. They spoke of how they had passed on the teachings, how they had shared the knowledge with other settlers, traders, and travelers. One of them even mentioned that a few cabins built with the Wind-Baffle Wall had become local landmarks, praised for their resilience. "You should know," the man said, stepping closer. "We've been calling it McAllister's Wall." At the mention of his name, Tom felt a pang of discomfort. He had never been one for titles or for the idea of leaving a legacy. His walls were just walls, a tool for survival. But as he looked around at the men standing before him, their faces worn but hopeful, he realized that something had shifted. They weren't just following a design, they were following a new way of thinking, one that valued the collective strength of the wilderness community. Tom didn't say anything for a long while. Instead, he simply stood there, watching the wind blow across the white landscape, his breath forming clouds in the cold, mountain air. Eventually he spoke, his voice low but firm. "If the wall keeps you alive," he said, "then that's all the thanks I need." And with that the men left, their footsteps fading into the snow, their legacy of survival now intertwined with his. Tom McAllister would never be a hero in the traditional sense, but in the mountains, among those who had learned from him, he was something more, a quiet pioneer of survival, whose walls would stand the test of time. As the years passed, the world beyond the mountains began to change. The winds of time, relentless as any storm, carried new settlers into the Rockies, hungry for land, for fortune, and for a life free from the constraints of city life. With them came new challenges, not just the cold, but the greed and ambition that always seemed to follow the expansion of civilization. Tom McAllister had never sought fortune or fame, but even the quietest corners of the wilderness were susceptible to the whispers of progress. In the late autumn of 1850, Tom's solitary existence was disturbed by a visitor. A man arrived on horseback, dressed in fine clothes that seemed out of place against the rugged backdrop of the mountain terrain. His face was sharp and his manner brisk. He introduced himself as Samuel Jacobs, an engineer from St. Louis, and his eyes gleamed with the kind of ambition that Tom had learned to recognize, the kind that had led men to do both great and terrible things in the name of progress. "I've heard the stories," Jacobs said, his voice smooth. "They say you've built something here, something that can withstand the mountain winds like nothing else." Tom looked at him warily, his hand resting on the handle of his rifle. He had spent years perfecting his Wind-Baffle Wall, and although he had shared the design with other trappers and settlers, he had never intended it to be commodified. "What is it you want?" Tom asked, his voice blunt, cutting through the politeness with a sharpness born of solitude. Jacob smiled as though he had expected this response. "I'm working on a project, a venture that could bring prosperity to these lands. I've seen the strength of your wall firsthand. I believe we can replicate it, improve upon it, and build something that will change the way people live in these mountains." Tom narrowed his eyes, sensing where this conversation was heading. "And what's in it for me?" Jacobs leaned forward, his voice low but confident. "If you share your designs with us, we'll make sure you're compensated fairly, not just in gold, but in land, a plot of your own, with resources to see you through the rest of your days." The offer was tempting. It always was. Land, security, a future free from the constant struggle for survival. But Tom knew better than to trust offers that sounded too good to be true. He had built his life on his own terms, on his own sweat, and on his willingness to sacrifice for what truly mattered: survival. "You don't understand," Tom replied, his voice steady but filled with warning. "This wall isn't just something you can sell. It's not about land or gold. It's about living, about keeping people safe. It's my way of ensuring that others have a chance to survive here. You're not the first man to come looking for a way to make money off of this wilderness, and you won't be the last." Jacobs paused, considering Tom's words. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was a calculating gleam, the kind of look that said he wouldn't give up easily. "We could do great things together, Tom," Jacobs said, standing up from his seat at the table. "I'll be here for as long as it takes. Think it over." The visitor left as quickly as he came, his horse's hooves echoing against the quiet mountain paths. Tom stood at the window, watching him disappear into the distance, his thoughts tangled. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of doubt. He had built something that could protect people, something that could change the way men lived in the wild. But was he ready to give up control of it? Was he ready to trust someone who saw the wall as little more than a product? Tom didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear: the price of survival was never as simple as it seemed. Months passed in a blur of cold winds and swirling snow. The seasons turned, and with them, Tom's solitude began to wear thin. He had spent years alone in the wilderness, living by his own rules, surviving by his wits. But the presence of Samuel Jacobs and the offers of land and gold had sparked something in Tom, a yearning for something he hadn't even realized he'd missed: community. Despite his reservations, Tom's mind often wandered back to Jacob's proposal. The notion of settling down in one place, no longer burdened by the constant battle for survival, tugged at him. The land, the resources, the promise of a future free from the uncertainty of the wild, they were all appealing in their own way. But Tom couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that if he gave in, if he sold his creation to the highest bidder, he would lose something far more valuable than any piece of land or sack of gold. One bitter evening in January, Tom found himself standing outside his cabin, staring at the snow-covered mountains in the distance. The wind had died down, and the world was eerily still. As he gazed into the silent landscape, he heard the sound of horses approaching. The noise was faint at first, but it grew louder as the riders came closer. Tom turned, his heart sinking as he recognized the familiar silhouette of Jacob's men. They came to a halt in front of his cabin, their horses stomping in the snow. Jacobs himself was at the front of the group, his coat flapping in the wind. "I've been thinking about our conversation, Tom," Jacobs called out, his voice carrying across the quiet landscape. "We've decided to move forward with the project. We'll be building a settlement, using your designs. We'll need you to come with us." Tom's gut twisted. He knew this was coming, knew that Jacobs would try to force his hand eventually, but even so, the reality of it hit him hard. The wilderness that had been his home for so many years, the place where he had built his walls and fought for his survival, was no longer his alone. The men dismounted, and Jacobs approached Tom with a smile. "We're going to make history here, Tom. This is your chance to be a part of something bigger than yourself." Tom looked at the men around him, their eager faces full of ambition. The mountain men, the settlers, all of them driven by the same desire to carve their own future out of the wild. But it wasn't their future he cared about. It was his own, and he wasn't ready to let go of it yet. "History's already been made here," Tom said, his voice low but steady, "and it's mine to keep." With that, he turned and walked back into his cabin, closing the door behind him. The wind outside howled, but Tom was done listening to anyone else's promises. The wilderness was his, and no one would take it from him. The future, he realized, was never about progress or prosperity. It was about survival. And that was something he would always fight for, no matter the cost. The months after Samuel Jacobs' visit were marked by a subtle but undeniable change in the air. The seasons shifted, but not just the weather. There was a tension now hanging thick over the mountains, as if the land itself could sense the encroachment of something new, something unwelcome. Tom McAllister had refused Jacobs' offer, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't just the weather, it was coming from within the wilderness itself. That winter was one of the harshest Tom had ever experienced. The snow piled higher than ever before, the winds blowing so fiercely that the very earth seemed to shudder. But it wasn't the physical storm that gnawed at Tom, it was the quiet, gnawing feeling that the world around him was changing in ways he couldn't control. One evening, while sitting by the fire and listening to the wind scream outside, Tom heard a faint noise, a distant, ominous sound. His instincts flared to life. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. It was a heavy, unnatural sound, carried by the wind. He stood up slowly, moving toward the window. Through the glass, he could see nothing but the swirling white of the snowstorm. But he felt it. He wasn't alone. Minutes later, there was a sharp knock at the door. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He didn't get visitors, not in the middle of a storm. His hand instinctively rested on the rifle leaning against the wall. When he opened the door, the wind howled in with a force that almost knocked him back. Standing there, bundled in heavy furs, was a figure he didn't recognize, a man whose face was hidden behind a thick beard, his eyes hard and determined. "I've come from Jacob's camp," the man said, his voice cutting through the wind. "We're building, whether you like it or not." Tom's blood ran cold. He knew what this meant. Jacobs had not forgotten his offer. In fact, he was making good on it in the most violent way possible. "They're here to take it," the man said, stepping forward. "We're building with or without you. You've got a choice. Join us or be left behind." Tom's grip tightened on the doorframe. His cabin, his creation, and his life were being threatened by the very thing he had fought so hard to protect, the ambition of men like Jacobs. Without a word, Tom closed the door, his mind racing. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break. The next morning, Tom didn't wait for the sun to rise. As the first light of dawn broke over the snow-covered peaks, he was already packing his things, readying himself for what he knew was coming. The storm had not yet passed, but it was nothing compared to the fight ahead. His cabin had once been his sanctuary, but now it was a battleground. Tom moved quickly, securing his gear and taking inventory of the few tools he could carry. His rifle was ready, the familiar weight of it grounding him in the present. He wasn't going to let Jacobs or anyone else take what he had built, not without a fight. Hours passed and the storm continued to rage, but Tom knew time was running out. The mountain men who had gathered at Jacobs's camp were close now, and if he didn't act, his home, the one place he could always find peace, would be lost. He made his way to the Wind-Baffle Wall. The wind, fierce and unrelenting, still tried to tear through the snow, but the wall held firm. Tom stood in front of it, his breath heavy in the cold air. This was his final stand, the place where he had first fought against nature's fury. Now he would fight against those who wanted to profit from the land he had made his own. The wall had done its job. It had protected him from the storm, but now it would be his shield against the men who came to tear down everything he had fought for. Tom McAllister would not be another man lost to ambition. He would not be another name written into the history of men who gave up everything for a fleeting promise of wealth. As the first footsteps echoed in the distance, Tom took one last look at the wall. It had kept the wilderness out. Now it would keep men out too. With rifle in hand, he waited for the storm to break. He was ready.